Things have a way of panning out over time in American history. On January 6th of 1807, there was a petition of stockholders soliciting bank recharter. There was, in the early days of the United States, an effort to create a Bank of the United States. Very brief explication of this is that after some contestation, including by members of the executive and members of the legislature, it was agreed to charter a Bank of the United States for a term of initially, I believe, 10 years, 20 years. And during its charter, it went forward despite some very, very compelling, provocative, even irate challenges by opponents of the bank in the early days. And after the charter ended, they did not renew it. It was one of those things where you can imagine there were probably people that a couple years in were like, oh, this is not what we thought it was. Maybe we should stop it. Well, we already started it. We already issued the stock. We already made the obligations. Yeah, but I mean, it's getting bad. Yeah, but we already made the obligations. Then you've got people that were against it from the onset, but they got sucked into it. They knew what the problems were. They knew it was a bad idea. You should have read some of the things they spoke of early on. What they said, why it should not have been passed to begin with. But there were others in Congress that thought they knew better. So they did it, and they subjected the entire country to it. And when the charter was done, they said, we're not renewing. We don't want to do this again. Now, nobody went to the Supreme Court and made a challenge to its constitutionality to the court to have the charter revoked. Years later, there was an impeachment of a president regarding an effort to make a second Bank of the United States. They impeached the president because of his stance on doing and resuming a paradigm they had already lived through. We had already lived through it as a country. All the way back. The Secretary of State, Senator from Virginia, the president asked everybody in the cabinet, got formal announcements about their perspective. These things are important now. It's important to know that Thomas Jefferson did not want the first Bank of the United States, a bank, by the way, that would have issued stocks based on the Three-Fifths Compromise, based on the predominant understanding at the time of what was allowed to be considered somebody's property. When we talk now about who was at fault, how America got to where it is, making a bank, assessing property to determine valuations in order to assess the public treasury, and then from that to create a charter for a specific bank on the federal government level that then is allowed to use the citizenry and the property of the citizenry for the business of the nation. They contested this. This is very contested. First charter ended up passing. They chartered the bank. They did not renew years later. But today is January 20th of 2021. And in 1815, on January 20th, President James Madison vetoes the 1814 bill to charter a second Bank of the United States. I'm going to read it. What did he say? To the Senate of the United States, having bestowed on the bill entitled an act to incorporate the subscribers to the Bank of the United States of America, that full consideration which is due to the great importance of the subject and dictated by the respect which I feel for the two houses of Congress, I am constrained by a deep and solemn conviction that the bill ought not to become a law, to return it to the Senate in which it originated with my objections to the same. waiving the question of the constitutional authority of the legislature to establish an incorporated bank as being precluded, in my judgment, by repeated recognitions under varied circumstances of the validity of such an institution in acts of the legislative, executive, and judicial branches of the government, accompanied by indications in different modes of a concurrence of the general will of the nation. The proposed bank does not appear to be calculated to answer the purposes of reviving the public credit, of providing a national medium of circulation, and of aiding the Treasury by facilitating the indispensable anticipations of the revenue, and by affording to the public more durable loans. 1. The capital of the bank is to be compounded by specie of public stock and of Treasury notes convertible into stock, with a certain proportion of each of which every subscriber is to furnish himself. The amount of the stock to be subscribed will not, it is believed, be sufficient to produce in favor of the public credit any considerable or lasting elevation of the market price, whilst this may be occasionally depressed by the bank itself if it should carry into the market the allowed proportion of its capital consisting of public stock in order to procure specie, which it may find its accounts in procuring with some sacrifice on that part of its capital. Nor will any adequate advantage arise to the public credit from the subscription of Treasury notes. The actual issue of these notes nearly equals at present and will soon exceed the amount to be subscribed to the bank. The direct effect of this operation is simply to convert 15 millions of Treasury notes into 15 millions of 6% stock, with the collateral effect of promoting an additional demand for Treasury notes beyond what might otherwise be negotiable. Public credit might indeed be expected to derive advantage from the establishment of a national bank, without regard to the formation of its capital, if the full aid and cooperation of the institution were secured to the government during the war and during the period of its fiscal embarrassments. But the bank proposed will be free from all legal obligation to cooperate with the public measures, and whatever might be the patriotic disposition of its directors to contribute to the removal of those embarrassments, and to invigorate the prosecution of the war, fidelity to the pecuniary and general interest of the institution, according to their estimate of it, might oblige them to decline a connection of their operations with those of the national treasury during the continuance of the war and the difficulties incident to it. Temporary sacrifices of interest, though overbalanced by the future and permanent profits of the charter, not being requirable of right in behalf of the public, might not be gratuitously made, and the bank would reap the full benefit of the grant, whilst the public would lose the equivalent expected from it. For it must be kept in view that the sole inducement to such a grant on the part of the public would be the prospect of substantial aids to its pecuniary means at the present crisis and during the sequel of the war. It is evident that the stock of the bank will, on the return of peace, if not sooner, rise in the market to a value which, if the bank were established in a period of peace, would authorize and obtain for the public a bonus to a very large amount. In lieu of such a bonus, the government is fairly entitled to, and ought not to relinquish or risk, the needful services of the bank under the pressing circumstances of war. Second, the bank, as proposed to be constituted, cannot be relied on during the war to provide a circulating medium, nor to furnish loans or anticipations of the public revenue. Without a medium, the taxes cannot be collected, and in the absence of specie, the medium understood to be the best substitute is that of notes issued by a national bank. The proposed bank will commence and conduct its operations under an obligation to pay its notes in specie or be subject to the loss of its charter. Without such an obligation, the notes of the bank, though not exchangeable for specie, yet resting on good pledges, and performing the uses of specie in the payment of taxes and in other public transactions would, as experience has ascertained, qualify the bank to supply at once a circulating medium and pecuniary aids to the government. Under the fetters imposed by the bill, it is manifest that, during the actual state of things, and probably during the war, the period particularly requiring such a medium and such a resource for loans and advances to the government, notes for which the bank would be compellable to give specie in exchange could not be kept in circulation. The most the bank could effect, and the most it could be expected to aim at, would be to keep the institution alive by limited and local transactions, which, with the interest on the public stock in the bank, might yield a dividend sufficient for the purpose until a change from war to peace should enable it, by a flow of specie into vaults and a removal of the external demand for it, to derive its contemplated emoluments from a safe and full extension of its operations. On the whole, when it is considered that the proposed establishment will enjoy a monopoly of the profits of a national bank for a period of 20 years, that monopolized profits will be continually growing with the progress of the national population and wealth, that the nation will, during the same period, be dependent on the notes of the bank for that specie of circulating medium, whenever the precious metals may be wanted, and at all times for so much thereof as may be eligible substitute for a specific medium, and that the extensive employment of the notes in the collection of the augmented taxes will, moreover, enable the bank greatly to extend its profitable issues to them, without the expense of specie capital to support their circulation. It is as reasonable as it is requisite that the government, in return for these extraordinary concessions to the bank, should have a greater security for attaining the public objects of the institution than is presented in the bill, and particularly for every practicable accommodation, both in the temporary advances necessary to anticipate the taxes and in those most durable loans which are equally necessary to diminish the resort to taxes. In discharging this painful duty of stating objections to a measure which has undergone the deliberations and received the sanction of the two houses of the national legislature, I console myself with the reflection that, if they have not the weight which I attach to them, they can be constitutionally overruled, and with a confidence that, in a contrary event, the wisdom of Congress will hasten to substitute a more commensurate and certain provision of the public exigencies. James Madison. Now, this is dated for today, 206 years ago. No, 206 years ago. 206 years ago. And this was after doing it once before, and doing it incorrectly, as was evident by the fact that after the charter finished, they did not recharter it. Now, I have previously, as a matter of fact, during this past summer, when there was some illegal coinage afoot, not only in the United States, by the way, read a statement from the former Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, regarding his very, very strong objection to the initial charter of the First Bank of the United States. Now, at that time, it passed. At this time, the president said no. He said, no, I veto it. In this time frame, the country was at war. It was understood. There's an understanding that a wartime declaration means something in terms of the obligations, in terms of what is expected. But it also means you don't fight a war intending to lose and give everything to somebody else and hope that you're going to make some profit for your company. Or maybe set up some options for your hedge fund for a couple of years while you're in office so that when you get out, you get to enjoy your own private slate based upon what you sliced up while you were in government. And that is apparently what has been done for the last 25 years. They just get in office long enough to get a couple of good options set up in their name. And rather than even bestowing it on to the person who comes in after them so that they can serve the constituency and performing their role in consideration of their committee assignments to provide for the welfare of the people, they rob us. These options they set up are not theirs. It's ours. When they don't close out a bill that they've let languish in committee for 30 years, it is our lives and our political capital they waste. When they do not do the job of demonstrating they've accounted for what they've put on the record as being their understanding of what the will of their people is, and then attending to it and following up on it, it is our lives and our capital that is wasted. For who? Who's been really getting these stocks? There was massive billions, trillions perhaps, of dollars worth of stock that was issued by Citigroup on exactly the 6th month after the initial COVID relief. 6 months later, they issued all this stock to their shareholders. How many people in the United States were shareholders in Citigroup by November of this last year? Let me ask you a question. How many members of the United States that have been centralized under this COVID 19 response are shareholders in Asian companies that were availed of the futures that were set up, that were swapped overnight right before the House tabled for 1 month a bill that would have been dedicated to federal loan forgiveness? They took a bill that was dedicated to federal loan forgiveness and tabled it for a month. What happened after that month? They blue sheeted it. There was a massive Citigroup, another conference in Asia, right around the time they were making these major futures deals on the Asian markets associated with the closing out of temporary life insurance policies, primarily based in Singapore. Singapore. They did this right before they spent a month loaning out the stock of college-age students and those responsible for federal loan repayment in this country. Didn't tell anybody about it. And they blue sheeted it at the end of the summer. Election interference. Did anybody pay attention? If it were up to me, I would absolutely veto it. All of it. Get those guardsmen out of D.C. They had no right to conspire, to slander people, expressing their constitutional right, and by the way, duty, to prevent against encroachments on the 13th Amendment, so that we could be made more pliable when we're sold or exported on foreign markets, connected to secret deals nobody wanted to tell us about while they executed them. It's not acceptable, because here's the thing. Even if they liquidate the government and give each of us a stock certificate, where are we going to invest it? If they wanted to have access to our capital, why didn't they serve us while they were in political office, rather than just spending their time in political office, making a bunch of other people fat off of us, so that when they got out, they could take us singly, solely, privately. That's what they're doing right now. It's unacceptable. It's unconstitutional. There's precedent. If we don't have anybody that's going to act precedential, then hopefully what we can do is understand that we did have them in the past. Whatever else you want to admonish him for. When it was time to make the right call, James Madison did it. It's been vetoed. You're not allowed to do it. Now, I want to see Congress provide an accounting for the trillions of dollars of obligation they set up in the last year. I want every member of Congress that agreed to approve these bills to set up a understanding that they have of the political capital investment of their constituencies. How do they define their constituencies? What committees are they on and responsible for? How many bills did they propose that are still languishing in committee? Well, the pork they set up in those bills ended up getting put into a relief package the rest of us are supposed to be obligated to, with terms that have not been disclosed even still. Do you have enough to override his veto? Could you override James Madison's veto? Because without being able to account for it, you better hope that in 60 days I don't find your name all over some sort of corporate brochure in another fucking country after you sold your own people.